The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson. Good luck with today's lesson.
We're going to focus on shareholder rights in corporations. So the ownership in a corporation is going to be represented by stock. And by the way, we can interchange the term stock or shares, just so you know, just like we can interchange the term shareholders and stockholders. Now, stock ownership does not give the shareholder rights in any particular property. Rather, the shareholder is going to be an owner with other shareholders of all corporate property. Thus, by owning stock, a shareholder has the right to receive a proportional share of any distribution of corporate assets, such as a dividend, and then the right to vote. Now, capital is the net assets of a corporation, and any shares that were issued to holders are going to be called outstanding. Capital stock will refer to the value received by the corporation for its outstanding stock. Corporate stocks may have a par value depending upon the state's corporation law. Book value is going to be found by dividing the value of the corporate assets by the number of shares outstanding, and the market value is going to be the price of the shares in the open market. Now, stock ownership is going to be evidenced by a certificate of stock or share certificate. There are different types of stock, and the different classes of stock will provide different priorities as well as different dividend rights. So what are the different types of stock? We have common stock, preferred stock, cumulative preferred stock, and participating preferred stock. Sorry, I didn't put the last two on the little slide sheet that you're looking at. But let's talk about common stock for a moment. What is common stock? If a corporation has only one kind of stock, it's generally going to be called common stock. The general rule here is that shareholders of common stock get dividends, voting rights, and a proportional share of any assets remaining once creditors are paid off when the corporation is dissolved. More than one class of common stock may exist. Another type of stock is going to be preferred stock. Now, preferred stock has some preference over common stock, and this should be spelled out in the corporation's articles. So what are the common preferences that preferred stock has over common stock? Well, it involves dividends, liquidation, convertibility, and voting. When dividends are paid, preferred stockholders will be paid first before any dividend is paid to common shareholders. Likewise, if there is liquidation, the preferred stockholders will get to share in the corporation's assets up to a certain rate before the common stockholders will obtain any distribution. Preferred stock may also be converted into a specific number of common stock or another class of preferred stock. Finally, preferred stock generally doesn't have any voting rights. The article should expressly deny preferred stock from voting. If it doesn't, the preferred stockholders will have a vote proportional to the number of preferred shares outstanding. Now, preferred stock may have cumulative dividend rights or non-cumulative dividend rights. What, though, is really the difference between these two? Preferred stock with cumulative rights have dividends that accrue if they aren't paid, whereas non-cumulative rights don't. So let's talk about the last two stocks, participating preferred stock. This participating preferred stock is going to be preferred stock with a special kind of dividend preference. Let's look at the following example. We have Santa's Workshop Corporation, and it has two classes of stock, preferred and common. The articles of incorporation state that the preferred stock is cumulative, with an annual $15 per share dividend. The company does well, and it employs only non-unionized elves. The company pays dividends every year before 2018. However, the elves go on strike. After the labor issues are resolved and the elves are back to making toys, Santa's Workshop Corporation declares a dividend again in 2019. How much will each preferred share get before the common gets anything? Well, if you guessed $30, you're correct, because the preferred stock will each receive $30 because it was cumulative. Santa's Workshop Corporation must pay back the original dividend of $15 plus the current dividend of $15 before the common shareholders receive anything. Let's kind of look at a variation to that above situation that we just discussed. Let's assume for a moment that the article for Santa's Workshop Corporation was silent on whether the preferred shares of stock are cumulative or non-cumulative. How do you think the courts will generally rule on this issue? Here, the general rule is that if the articles are silent on the cumulative or non-cumulative issue, the presumption is going to be that the stock is cumulative. Now we're going to discuss a bond. And what is a bond? A bond is a writing that promises to repay a loan of money to a corporation. Thus, a bond is an instrument issued by a corporation to persons lending its money. A bond has a specified principal amount, interest rate, and repayment debt. Other contract terms may require a sinking fund for purposes of ensuring repayment. Bond holders don't vote either. What is the company's authorized stock? Authorized stock is actually the number of shares a corporation may issue. Now, articles of incorporation will list the authorized stock. And the authorized stock is important because the corporation cannot issue more stock or stock of a different class than what the articles authorize. So if the corporation does issue more, then the holder of the unauthorized shares will not have any ownership rights. Please note that the board of directors may amend the articles, though, to increase the authorized stock shares. Shares of issued stock are going to be different from shares of authorized stock. Authorized shares that are sold are issued by the corporation to the purchaser. Now, generally, a corporation may issue shares in return for consideration. And there are 3 types of consideration that are considered valid payment for shares. What do you think they would be? They are money paid, labor or services already performed for the corporation, and property acquired. Now, shares can be acquired from the corporation by subscription or purchased on the open market. Contracts for sale of shares need not be in writing under the most recent revision of Article 8 of the UCC. What are stock subscriptions? Stock subscriptions are agreements in advance to purchase shares of a corporation when the shares are sold. Pre-incorporation subscriptions carry the protection of being irrevocable by the subscriber for 6 months. Restrictions on transfer of shares are valid so long as they are reasonable and noted on the shares. Shares are going to be transferred by endorsement and delivery. The corporation treats those persons listed on its records as the owners of the shares. Notification of transfer is required for the transferee to receive notices and dividends from the corporation. If a certificate is lost, stolen, or destroyed, it can be replaced if the owner obtains an indemnity bond. Now, shareholders have the right to certificates evidencing ownership, the right to transfer shares, and the right to vote. And voting may be either a one share, one vote process or a process of cumulative voting whereby each share gets the votes equal to the number of directors being elected. Remember, though, that generally only the shareholders of record are entitled to vote. Shareholders can vote by proxy, and they can enter into voting agreements or assign voting rights to a trust in order to pool their voting power. Let's look at the straight voting versus the cumulative voting for a moment. Assume you have candy in front of you, and that represents your share of stocks. So, if you happen to have 10 pieces of candy, go ahead and grab those 10 pieces of candy. Let's look at straight voting. What is straight voting? Straight voting is where each shareholder is going to be entitled one vote on each matter to be voted. So each candy will represent a shareholder for you. If the members were voting for directors and straight voting were used, could the minority shareholders ever elect an officer? No, they're not going to be able to. So let's look at the following example. Assume we have Melanie, and Melanie owns 600 shares of stock while Joe only owns 400 shares. Melanie would always be outvoted Sorry about that. I didn't mean to say Melanie would be outvoted. It's Joe would always be outvoted if 5 directors were to be elected because he only owns what? 400 shares, while Melanie owns 600. Now, cumulative voting here, this type of voting allows for minority shareholders to have proportional representation on the board of directors. So let's look at the following formula that could be used when you're determining the number of shares that are necessary to elect a director. Formula we could look at is X equals W times N plus 1 plus T. X would be your number of shares needed to elect the selected number of directors. W is your total number of directors the minority shareholders want to elect, while N is going to be the number of shares voting at the meeting. If we go back to our scenario from above, okay, and you use that example with Melanie and Joe, what would be the outcome if we had used cumulative voting? Here, Melanie would be able to elect 3 directors, while Joe would be guaranteed to elect 2 directors. Because don't forget that T is the total number of directors that would be elected. Let's talk about preemptive rights. Preemptive rights, if provided, will give the shareholder a right of first refusal if new capital stock is issued so that the shareholder can retain his or her ownership interest level in the corporation. The appropriate remedy will depend on whether the shares are available on the open market or not. If the shares are available on the open market, the shareholder is entitled to damages. But if they aren't, the shareholder is then entitled to specific performance. Now, shareholders also have a right of access to books and records for business purposes, and they're entitled to annual financial statements. Let's talk about a dividend for a moment. What is a dividend? A dividend is a pro rata distribution of a corporation's property to its shareholders. Dividends can be declared by the board and they're valid if the corporation is solvent. A dividend may be paid in the form of shares as a stock dividend. The corporation must have lawful sources from which to pay dividends, but the directors cannot declare dividends if there is not any reasonable business objective justifying the dividend policy, or the policy resulted from improper motives and harmed either the corporation or certain shareholders. So what are some examples of improper failure to declare dividends? They are refusing to declare dividends as a means of reducing personal tax liability, refusing to declare dividends as part of a scheme to squeeze out minority shareholders, and the directors utilize funds that could have been spent on dividends for high salaries and bonuses to the detriment of the shareholders. Now, shareholders have the right to sue officers and directors for damages they caused to the corporation, and these lawsuits are referred to as derivative lawsuits because the shareholders enforce the rights of the corporation. There are steps a plaintiff must take before he files an action with the court in a derivative lawsuit. The shareholder who files a derivative claim must first exhaust internal procedures. So this shareholder, who is the plaintiff, must make a demand on the directors to remedy the problem. Many states do require that this plaintiff shareholder make a demand on the shareholders. Let's look at page 916 for a moment in your textbook. That will detail for you the two things that the shareholder must establish. First, they have to show that the directors refuse to enforce the right, and two, that the demand that the directors enforce the right is excused because the directors are deemed incapable of making an impartial decision regarding the pursuit of the litigation. Now, shareholders do enjoy limited liability. Remember, that was one reason why you wanted to incorporate. Remember, it was a great advantage. The most you stood to lose as a shareholder was what you invested in the payment for your share. Now, shareholders have personal liability to creditors only if they have not paid their subscriptions or have paid less than par value for their shares. Professional corporations are statutory creatures that will limit liability for the owners, with the exception of malpractice liability. Whether owners are liable for the malpractice of an associate will vary from state to state. What is piercing the corporate veil? If the corporate veil is pierced, the corporation is going to be disregarded, and in the typical case, shareholders are subjected to unlimited liability for the corporation's unsatisfied debts. Generally, courts will not allow piercing the corporate veil if corporate formalities are substantially observed, the corporation's initial financing was reasonably adequate, and the corporation was informed to evade existing obligations or otherwise to cheat or defraud creditors. So when we're talking about piercing the corporate veil, the analogy I want to leave you with here before I end the chapter is this. Think of the corporation as you standing underneath an umbrella. You're out, it's raining. The umbrella is giving you protection, right? That limited liability. But what happens all of a sudden? It starts hailing. After a while, the hail starts putting little holes in your umbrella, and eventually you start getting wet because the rain starts coming through. That's what piercing the corporate veil is doing. It's kind of popping the hole in the umbrella where now they can actually go after you, and you could be subject to some personal liability. If you have any questions on this chapter, please let me know.
Good luck with today's lesson.